right, well, I'll go ahead and get started with the announcements. If I can share my screen, we're trying to show you that Leah, our past president from last year, our 2022 chapter president, and myself, Chris Werner, executive director of the AIA Silicon Valley chapter, coming to you live from Washington, DC, AIA Leadership Summit. So for those of you not here, it's a great summit. This is formerly Grassroots, now renamed the Leadership Summit. Highly recommended. If there's advocacy work that you'd like to do for our chapter, we have an advocacy committee, and today was Day on the Hill. So our architects hit the hill hard and spoke to all of our representatives and pushed initiatives forward that are important to the AIA organization. So we're happy to be here to share that with you. So this is our February chapter meeting. This is the 2022 California Building Codes update, and we'll get into that after we go through some of our upcoming events. So there we go. Okay, upcoming events. So live from AIA Leadership Summit. This is after 2 years of virtual events. So we're very excited to be here in person, along with all of our AIA leadership. Okay, so Wednesday, February 22nd from 6 to 9 p.m. at Mitchell Park Community Center, the COAT partnership event with BABSC, which is a new organization, building systems, Bay Area Building Science Collaborative. And this is an organization that is a new startup, and they're working closely with our COAT committee to provide events. And this will be an extension of a wildfire smoke building systems program that was done last year. They're going to get into an in-depth panel discussion to delve into one of the most important aspects of building resiliency, and that's protecting the health and safety of building inhabitants from the effects of wildfire fires. Save the date. Our March chapter meeting is going to be hosted by our WIA organization committee, excuse me, Wednesday, March 15th, 6 to 9 p.m. Beyond Architecture. This is the Women in Architecture and a panel discussion on alternate career paths.
In person, come join us.
Yes, in
lots
person.
of our current and former committee members as well. Speaking.
Yeah, and this will be hosted by Inside Source, so it'll be in person at Inside Source on Park Avenue. A23 coming up. Just like our WLS hosted in California last year, we have the A23 hosted again, bringing national to California. The San Francisco chapter will be hosting the AIA Conference on Architecture, June 7th to the 10th. I know that not all of the programs and workshops have been announced yet, but we do know that the East Bay has some boat tours in the Bay, some architectural boat tours that sound like they're going to be very exciting. And so those are part of the planning. Keep an eye out for that. And with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie Silkwood, our 2023 chapter president.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to first thank our sustaining partners. Next slide, please. There we go. Our premier sponsor is Earthbound Homes. Our gold sponsors, we have Block Construction, Arch IT, and Bernardo Photography. Our silver sponsors, Clarity Home Builders, Inc., ZFA Structural Engineers, CAW Architects, ERRCS, Grigg Systems, and HMH. And also want to thank all our wonderful volunteers and invite those of you who aren't engaging with any of our committees. We have a lot of opportunity and need for folks to help us out and help put together some of these wonderful programs. Currently very active in planning efforts. We have our Design Awards Committee. We have our home tours. And then our programs committee, which plans our monthly events. And we need help. We really think it's a great opportunity for people to get out and expand their network and meet other folks and contribute to the greater good for our architecture community here. If you want to volunteer, you can contact our chapter office. You can check out our website. We have some descriptions of the various committees. And we especially want to thank the fire consultants for joining us tonight to give us this presentation. For those who are not familiar with the fire consultants, they offer code consulting services. They would love to get to know you and work with you in the future. And presenting tonight, we have Hamed and Prajakta, and they will introduce themselves. Without further ado, let you guys take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie and Kristen, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Again. Yeah, this is Hamed Salehi with the fire consultants. I'm a registered fire protection engineer and fire protection consulting engineer, project manager at the fire consultant, been with the firm since 2019. And then today we're gonna, Prajakta and I are gonna review the overall code changes in the 2022 code cycle. So I'll just pass to Prajakta for the introduction.
Hello, everyone. My name is Prajakta Dabadi. I'm a fire protection engineer, code consultant with the fire consultants. Thanks for having us today, and thank you to all for joining this evening. So I joined fire consultants I'm in December of 2022, fairly new to fire consultants, but not new to the industry. This is my 18th year, and I've been in the Bay Area since 2007. So with that said, let's see what the program looks like today here. So we'll go through a brief introduction regarding fire consultants, what we do, and then we'll get into the building code development, and we will dive into the California Building Code 2022 edition, and we'll go through like chapters 1 through 10 primarily, and we will highlight some of the changes. And I understand this is like a very diverse group and coming from various different backgrounds as far as project types and interests. So again, take a look at this as like an overview of the code changes, and I will appreciate if you can hold your thoughts and your questions towards till the end, and we'll get to all of your questions. We have a lot of information to present, so we will, to be precise, we have about 70 slides here, so we'll try to get through it as quickly at the same time as efficiently as we can. Next slide, please.
Prajakta, would you like for people to jot down their questions in the chat as we go, and then we can hit them at the end?
Sure, that's fine. No problem.
The way they don't get
That's
forgotten.
Yeah, actually, that's a good idea. Yeah, because sometimes it's easy to really forget things. So, okay. We are a fire and life safety, fire protection consulting firm. We've been in the Bay Area since 2006. Our focus has been on building code consulting as well as fire protection engineering. And our team consists of registered fire protection engineers and mechanical engineers with average experience of 20 years. And we have offices here as well as in North Carolina, but we enjoy doing project work throughout the US continent. And as far as our expertise, I think we have done, again, I don't see the list of all the people here, but we have done a lot of project work with most of you, and it's focusing on like smoke control modeling for like atrium projects. We do a lot of high-rise buildings, overall fire life safety, egress drawing reviews, alternate design methods of construction, engineering judgments, and we also review fire alarm, sprinkler, and oral fire assemblies. And Hamid, would you like to add anything to the previous slide?
No, I think those are
Okay. Okay, no problem.
Thanks.
Okay. So yeah, I can. Yeah. So the general history of model like building codes. If you go back in like 60s and 70s, if you have done any projects with those older buildings, we have seen a lot of like UBC uniform building codes. And then eventually, of course, we have NFPA and IAPMO, and eventually the ICC was formed in, I believe, late or early 2000s. And California, we picked up the ICC code starting, I believe, 2007 was the first IBC code that we adopted. And the code cycle is like every 3 years. And now we are entering from our previous code cycle, which was 2019, which was based upon the 2018 IBC. And we're getting into the 2022, brand new codes, very exciting, a lot of information. And every day we look at the project, and every project has very unique requirements, and there is everything. I mean, we learn as code consultant every single day, something new about the new code. So we're trying to share what we know thus far. And of course, next time we talk to you, we will have more information. And so this new code, any project that is submitted on or after the January 1st of this year, it will fall into this new code cycle. Of course, there are exceptions. Like if you already had a project in plan check and you had like a 1 or 2 cycles of plan check or plan review, then you can continue with those. And there could be some projects where I don't want to call it grandfathered, but kind of grandfathered in, then they may continue with the previous code cycle. But anything that is submitted for permit in 2022, that will fall into this new code cycle, including your tenant improvement projects. Next slide, please. Yeah, so next couple of slides is it's pretty much all the different codes under the Title 24. Again, today's focus is on building codes, but of course there are other codes like fire code and mechanical, electrical. All those have some changes in most of the chapters. Go to the next. Yeah. So now we'll get actually into the 2022 California Building Code discussion here. So we have like 1 through 10 chapters, and we have a couple of 1 or 2 or 3 slides for every chapter. We try to pick up some of the kind of key highlights, kind of a trailer. This is not a full movie, so this is like just a trailer that you will get like some flavors of what's coming in to the codes. Next, thank you. Yeah, and as most of us know, like this building code has specific requirements on other like agencies throughout the state, like State Fire Marshal, or it could be DSA, it could be OSHPD. Actually, the OSHPD has now been changed to ERRCS. So and every like chapter would have like those specific requirements associated with those set of agencies. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah, and I think at the beginning of every chapter, you would see that particular chapter, like here, like I think chapter 3 is shown here, but every chapter has like this one of the first pages that you would see like which section is adopted by which agency. So not necessarily every section is adopted by every agency. So when you apply to a project, just take a look at this. I think this is super helpful to understand if you're doing a State Fire Marshal project versus if you're doing a DSA project versus you're doing ERRCS project. Again, there are like all these specific requirements. Next, please. Yeah. So starting in like very first chapter, change of occupancy. So there are these kind of subtle changes among the various requirements, and this, when we start looking into the code, this is the very first change where you will see there is like, again, subtle changes to like what a change in occupancy means. And again, I would love to go through every detail like that's we're sharing on the screen. At the same time, we have tons of information that we want to go through. So I will go through some of this slides a little quicker than I'd like to, but we'll definitely stay towards the end of the presentation to answer any questions. Next, please.
I also just want to add, if you have access to the like the web version of the code, you can see the changes in the 2020 code marked with the blue text. So as of here, if you have the access, either like the free version or the paid version through the ICC website, whenever you see a blue text, that means that text was revised or added in the new code cycle. So that's something that might be helpful. So yeah, thanks Projector for the thorough introduction. As going forward through the chapters in the California Building Code, in chapter 2, we have all the definitions that we need for the building code. Let's say if you want to see like what building considered as high-rise, the place we need to go is chapter 2. So it defines the high-rise building. So there are that different items that everyone might have their own definition. Like let's say if we say this is a toxic material or not, I might have different definition in my mind for a toxic material than someone else. So the place we need to start is from the definition and see what toxic defined in the building code, so we can see the applicable requirement. So there are some changes in the definition chapter of the code, not major one, but there are some like minor that can make differences in the design. For example, one of the ones that we've crossed recently is like the code defines a secondary structural member, that the bracing where members have been updated in the new code, and just very small tweak with added, so that might change the structural design or the requirement for the secondary structural members in the code. So yeah, again, I would highly suggest whenever you have a term, you want to see what it really means, the first step, start with the code, is going to definition, look for the term like what is the secondary structural element per the building code, and then from chapter 2 you can at least for the first step find out what those words mean per the code. As we move on to the next chapter, we have the chapter 3. Chapter 3 basically defines the different use and the occupancies in the building, starting from the assembly group, going to business, all the way to different common or uncommon occupancies, and basically provide a short definition and some example for each occupancies. And there are not much changes in the new code. There are some definition added for the special amusement areas, like the code added definition for the escape room or the puzzle room, and then added some items for distillery brewing facilities, but there are not major changes in general in chapter 3 for the use and occupancy classification. As we move on, chapter 4 is basically providing the requirements for the special use building. So there are, in general, we have two types of special use. One is the general special use, like high-rise building, atrium, underground building, which they typically don't have any specific use or occupancy, but they can have different occupancies with it. But they have like a general common feature, like a building that is going to be a high-rise, but it can be either like a group B occupancy or group A occupancy or whatever the occupancy group is. But just being for a high-rise building, it needs to meet certain features and the code requirements. So those are covered in the first half of the first portion of the chapter 4. And then as we move on in chapter 4, there are the occupancy specific requirement, like now what if you have like a group R occupancy, what are the requirements? So those are also listed if there is any specific occupancy, a specific requirement. Those are all listed in chapter 4. One example for the general occupancy is definitely high-rise building. We've seen many projects that these requirements are applicable. Basically, the code defines a high-rise building when the highest occupied level is more than 75 feet from the lowest fire department access. Then if you have a high-rise building, then there are a lot of requirements that are applicable to the building, like from the smoke control to fire pump. And then also there are some other items like secondary water supply for the building more than 120 feet, or having the ERRCS emergency responder coverage, or having the smoke-proof enclosure, such as the pressurized stair. And these are all listed in chapter 4 for the high-rise building. Again, we don't have much major changes in the new code for the high-rise building. Most of the requirements are carried over from the 2019 code. So there might be very small details that have been updated. The other type of the project that still under the general special use of the building is the project where you have the atrium. Per the code, when you have an atrium that's connecting more than 2 stories, then you would need to meet certain requirements, which the main one is having the smoke control exhaust approach to avoid smoke spreading throughout the atrium. So basically the code wants, if you have a fire inside the atrium, the fire produce smoke and reduce the tenability in the areas that are open to the atrium. Therefore, you need to add some sort of smoke control exhaust approach to avoid this issue and to avoid reducing the tenability in the areas that are open to the atrium. So whenever you have in a building, you have more than atrium connecting more than 2 stories, then you have to go to chapter 4, look for the requirement that are specifically to the atrium. There are some instances that you have an atrium that like this figure here, that is open to only 2 stories, but separated with the shaft construction from the other stories. So these still might not require smoke control because it's only open to 2 stories. But if you want to open any other floors that now you have connecting more than 2 stories, then you would need to apply those requirements. Per the new code, most of the requirements are carried over from the previous code. There are some updates for the egress through the atrium. which allows more like 50% of the stairs located in the same atrium. And then there are some more allowances for the openings in the escalator and open stairs when we meet certain requirements in the code. But in general, most major items are carried over from the previous code cycle. Again, as we move on, we have other type of special occupancies, like group H occupancies. So basically, the code defines certain hazardous materials in chapter 2, and then in chapter 4 provides the maximum allowable quantities of those hazardous materials. So whenever we exceed those quantities, then the occupancy need to be changed to group H. So if we are going to group H, then again in chapter 4, there are a lot of different requirements for group H occupancy depending on the type of the hazard, and we need to meet those in our design. One of the changes that was occurred in the new code cycle is now when each portion of the building is separated by firewall, then you can assume those as a separate building per section 41423. So that helps you to calculate the maximum allowable quantities for each portion that is separated by the firewall. But again, most of the other items like the maximum allowable quantities or the hazardous material definition all carried over from the previous code version. So there are not major changes in those. A new section that has been added to chapter 4 for a special use is the mechanical access enclosed parking garages. So you might see in these in example like Carvana or other like automatic parking structures when you just park the vehicle at the front and then a lot of mechanical automation happen to park your car somewhere. So in the past, the code really didn't address these structures, but as we see in them more frequently, the code provides requirement for these type of structures. In section 40664, which lists like different requirements for these type of garage structure, including the 2-hour separation, adding a mechanical smoke removal system, emergency shutdown switch for the automation, fire control equipment room, and fire department access doors. And then again, as we've seen more frequently, the special amusement areas have been updated. We've seen the puzzle room or escape room that are being more common and are being added to the code. So the code specifically says if you have these type of amusement area, you have to meet the chapter 10 egress requirements, or you have to have an approved alternative design, or have exits open readily, meaning not being locked, and being unlocked upon fire alarm activation, and also provided with sprinkler system and the manual control for the exit door locks. And then in the past, the special amusement section was referred to special amusement building, but now it's been referred as an area, which can be an area inside the building. So wherever you have a room that meets the puzzle room, then that room alone can be applicable to this section. Again, we have other type of special use and requirement in chapter 4, the other example is the group L occupancies. After the pandemic, we've seen many buildings, especially the office buildings, want to switch to the lab buildings. That happens for many of my projects, that core and shell design, they wanted to have an office space, but when the pandemic happened, a lot of office work turned into hybrid, but the lab type work still was in person. So a lot of project that I was working on, they decided to change the occupancy to lab, so they can find or they can lease the areas to more tenants. So basically, if you want to have a group lab occupancy, it allows us to having more hazardous material, more than the maximum allowable quantities that we discussed. But it has a lot of different requirements and limits that are listed in chapter 4. But basically, no major changes was in the lab requirement from 2019 code to 2022 code. But again, those are listed in chapter 4. So going to chapter 5, I have asked project to continue the.
Sure. So chapter 5 is like the overall height and area. This is where we start. Once you define what the occupancy for the project is, then you get into, okay, like how big or how small the building can be in area as well as in height. And again, there are like subtle changes in this chapter as far as some of the equations have been kind of revised, some of the language has been modified. And then the tables itself for like allowable height, allowable area, there have been modifications. And of course, one of the big modifications you see is that type 4 mass timber buildings. And I think it's not like that brand new, because if you recall 2019 code, California code did not have type 4. And I'll talk about type 4 once we get to chapter 6, but just wanted to highlight that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think the subtle changes in this height and allowable area tables here is the sprinkler increases are kind of included within the table now, and I think that's one of the change. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then as you go through these equations, like there have been like some slight modifications to the equation itself, or actually the more than I think equation. I think it's the again fine print, I call it. Like once you start applying, like, okay, it's a single story building, it's a multi-story building. Do I have a mixed occupancy versus a single occupancy building? And so again, the mixed occupancy buildings, talking of that, it starts like with some of the ratios, like, and I believe we have it's in a couple more slides. I think we have a example of the how to do the mixed area calculations. And again, as related to the allowable areas are kind of a combination of, you have one base tabular area from that table that we just shared, and then you add, if you have building sprinkler, you add for sprinkler increase some percentage, and then you add some increase for your frontage. And again, California, that you cannot, like for the state fire marshal building, the sprinklers can be used only for either height increase or sprinkler increase. We can't use both, unlike some of other states. So for frontage, what this 2022 California Building Code has done is, I think it is more streamlined as far as, okay, there is a table, you take a look at the table, and then you review your project accordingly. I think this table was not there in the past, so there was always like, how do I calculate what is? So I think this blue text you see is a newly added table. It just provides more clarification as far as, okay, what is like the width of my frontage. So the frontage is like, you have a building perimeter, and the frontage is any side of your building perimeter that faces 20 feet wide open space minimum. And according to that, you can look at this table and use that in the calculations. Again, there are exceptions for some of the unlimited building area types that you can look into chapter 5. Yeah, next please. Yeah, occupied roof. So this 2022 building code, it kind of clarifies the occupied roof. So just because you have occupied roof, that doesn't automatically cause extra story, as long as it does not call extra story, as long as the rooftop structure meets the definition from chapter 15 for penthouses. And if you have like an occupied roof where you're like some roof terrace, like assembly, small assembly occupancy. So there are requirements as far as like, you need to have like the voice evac system if the building has voice evac system. And then if you have a rooftop assembly occupancy, you can have it as long as the floor below is allowed to have a group A assembly. And again, I'm talking about the outdoor assembly, not like indoor. Indoor will be like your new story. Next slide, please. So the mezzanine area, I think it's 1/3 the area of the floor below. And so there are like some special cases where you have sprinklers, and if you have like voice evac system, there are specific requirements in type 1 and 2 construction buildings. There are again special requirements as far as the dwelling, the residential buildings. And the means of, oops, sorry, I saw the pop up on the questions, got distracted, sorry about that. So as far as, so again, there are like subtle changes as far as the mezzanine, and sometimes it's some projects it's very, very key to, because sometimes I have seen the design team calls this story as like, oh, it's a mezzanine. But then when you start actually looking into it, it's a separate story. It doesn't meet the actual requirements of a mezzanine. So I think it's crucial to review these requirements to be able to correctly classify if it's a mezzanine versus if it's a story. Next slide, please. Yeah, the mixed occupancy, I think this table, maybe I will take a step back. So in chapter 5, you can design a building, I believe, in 2 different ways. One is if you have a mixed use occupancy, you can do mixed occupancy non-separated use, or you can do separate mixed occupancy separated use. And the big difference between those 2 approaches is that when you design as a separated use, you are pretty much separating all the occupancies, and you are putting your occupancy separation, rated separations between your A's and A and group B's and all that. But then when you are doing a non-separate use, you're designing the building to the most restrictive occupancy as far as like the overall allowable building area calculations, height calculations for your fabrication systems, fire alarm systems. And once you define the buildings, the most restricted occupancy, as far as all those requirements, most of the occupancy separations can be limited. There are some exceptions, such as group H occupancies, where you still need to put those occupancy separations. And again, this table related to the separations has been kind of made it a little bit more user-friendly as far as how you apply it. For example, if you have a group A occupancy, if it's sprinklered, and then you look at your group trying to find B. Yeah. If you look at, I'm looking at horizontally group A, and then I'm looking at vertically group B. If you have a sprinkler building, that's like 1 hour separation. Thank you, Hamid. That's so super helpful. And again, we're talking about the separated use, but then again, if it's a non-separated, then you don't need that separation. And there is always this accessory occupancy section where the accessory occupancy is your total of that particular occupancy. The area needs to be 10%. It can be maximum 10% of the floor area. So if you have again, just hypothetically, 100 square feet floor area, then your the accessory cannot be more than 10% of that 100 square feet. You can control 100,000. 100 will be too small, but just hypothetically. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this incidental use table, it is, so I believe this is irrespective of how you classify your building, like overall occupancy, as far as you do separated or non-separated. I think this incidental use table is still kind of applicable. And as you can see in this table, a lot of it is, if you have sprinklers, like for example, if you pick up, let's say, one of the requirements or one of the rooms, like it says 1 hour or separate sprinklers. So a lot of times with sprinklers, this you again kind of compensate for rated separation. So there has been some addition to this table as far as in your I2s or your I3 occupancies, your hospitals or jail occupancies. So next slide, please. Yeah, again, this is the overall accessory occupancy I just briefly discussed. It is, again, it's the total of that particular occupancy. Like for example, if you have a classic example is you have like a 4-story group B occupancy. And if you have your conference rooms that are less than 10% of your each office floor, we don't have to worry about the separating it. That's one way to do it. And the other way to do it, you design the building to the most restricted occupancy and kind of eliminate the separations between your group B and group A, which is your office areas and your conference rooms. And yeah, so again, coming back to the non-separated occupancies, I think this is kind of an example where you have all this different, and you can mix and match. I think you can have a building where some floors are separated occupancy and some floors can be non-separated occupancies. It's a little bit kind of complicated, but that can be done. And then again, but coming to your group H occupancy is always irrespective of what overall building approach is. Your group H is always going to have those separations. Same thing with the incidental use, like those incidental use areas will still have separation unless the sprinklers are included in that table as an option. Next slide, please. Yeah, so again, there's an example on this screen. I won't go through each and every detail, but just a kind of a overview where when you have a separated use, and if you have like mixed use occupancy, like the way you look at it is you add all per floor your group A's, per floor your group R1s, per floor your group like A3s or M's, and then do this allowable area calculations and then do a ratio, and that ratio should be for your group state farm marshal occupancies should be less than 2, and for others it can be less than 3. And that's how it's kind of how you check if you're for that particular construction type for the building that you're desiring to have, like the size and the height. I think that's how you do the mixed area calculations. And it's again, it may seem complex, but it's not that complex. It's again, you straightforward. Yeah, the horizontal the podiums, these are our favorite residential apartment projects with, you have your type 1A parking garage, 1, 2, 3, whatever floors you have, and then you have a solid 3-hour separation. On top of that, you have either your type 5s or your type 4s or your type 3As, all those. And again, I think the interesting part of the design is like the number of stories is still separate. The number of stories for your type 1A construction versus the number of stories for your above your 3-hour separation. It could be your type 3s, your type 5. The number of stories are counted as separate for separate construction types. But the key is the overall height. So the height of the building should not be more than what are the less fire resistive rated construction type. In this case, if you have type 1 and you have type 3, the overall height is then limited by your type 3 construction. So again, there are limitations on like this. You're below your 3-hour separation. Generally, the group H2s cannot be not allowed. And so I think there are like different ways, again, alternate methods and all that you can use, but that's general the base code. And let's see. Yeah, there are some in the new code, there are some I think concessions as far as this combustible construction type 1A. And then there are limitations on what you can do and what you cannot. But again, that's kind of a highlight from this podium approach. Next slide, please. Yeah, this again from the same section, you can see like this the 2022 California Building Code, the maximum height allowed for your type 3A, your group R1 and R2, that has been increased than the previous code. It's again, there are limitations as far as like the 2-hour firewalls. You cannot have more than like 3,000 square feet. And that's kind of a very restrictive requirement, but by restricting the size, the code is allowing you to go higher up in the as far as the height. And again, honestly, I have yet to come across this 3,000 square feet style project. We see a lot of projects with like firewalls for allowable area for in your group 3A or your group 5s. But again, limiting this to 3,000, it's, again, I have yet to see if you have done or seen. Of course, we'll talk towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is super interesting as far as the construction types. And as if you recall, I'm looking on this slide as well, because I have a second screen where I can see what's the next slide. So just FYI. So if you recall the 2019 code, if you look at the base California code, it didn't have the type 4 different type 4 constructions. It had only type 4 heavy timber. And then I believe it was 2021 July, that's where the supplement came in. That's where all these different other type 4A, type 4B, and type 4C were introduced to the code. And I recently come across this, one of the projects where I had to do some research, and it's very interesting. If you look at your type 4 heavy timber and you look at type 3A, it allows use of FRT in the exterior walls. But same thing if you look at type 4C or 4ABC, it doesn't allow, specifically 4C. Most of the things are, again, these are different construction types, but the interesting things that when I looking through the code was that the FRT is not allowed in type 4C. And by doing that, the code allows another 3 stories of type 4C, versus because type 3 and type 4, they allowed FRTs, it has lower number of stories than the type 4C. Again, very interesting the way all these requirements are included. Next slide, please. Yeah, again, this is as far as like the table, again, introduction of type 4C. Again, it's not shown as blue because it is not quite new. It came in 2019 July supplement, so but at the same time, a lot of projects coming up as far as type 4. And from this chapter 6, there is to be table 602 regarding the exterior wall rating. That table is gone. That table is not in chapter 6 anymore. It is moved to chapter 7, and we'll get to that table here soon. Next slide, please. And again, again, chapter 7 has a lot of kind of subtle changes as far as the change in the language, and it's once you start applying some of these requirements to the project, I think it becomes makes things very, very interesting, like changing a word here and there, how it changes the interpretation, how it changes application to the project. I think it's, again, very, very interesting. So I will leave at that, and then we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so one of the changes as far as like, so for example, like the smoke barriers. Generally, we see smoke barriers in R 2.1, assisted living. You know what, just give me a second. My doorbell rang. I was expecting my son. He's middle school. Just give me a second. Let me just open it. Sorry about the interruption.
While we're waiting for Prajakta to come back, you all are welcome to put any of your questions in the chat if you think of them as we're going through, and then when we come back for Q&A, we can go through the chat, or you can save your questions for the end as well.
Yeah, so I'm back. I used my phone to open the garage so our son can come.
Nice.
So yeah, so coming back to the smoke barriers. So yeah, so the R2.1, which is like assisted living, I2, your healthcare occupancies, you would see smoke barriers generally. And the slight, again, this changes to the building code is the smoke barrier stays to be required to go from exterior wall to exterior wall. Now the code has changed as far as like, yeah, you can terminate your smoke barrier to another smoke barrier. So that's kind of a change. Next slide, please. Again, I will go through some of these slides a little bit quickly, because there are other slides that we need to go through. So again, as far as the overall changes in chapter 7, there are subtle changes. Again, the atriums, we have some changes. The balconies and stories in group A and A1 and A4, A5 occupancies that are not considered stories, like as far as like they comply with 505. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the table that disappeared from chapter 6, table 602, has now showed up in chapter 7. I think it makes sense. I think it just flows well, and they added more kind of again, chapter. I see all the type 4 construction has been like added to this table, so that's kind of a change in moving. The things have moved in from chapter 6 to chapter 7. Next slide, please. Again, no specific changes to this table. Again, if this table allows unlimited openings, then your exterior wall is not necessarily need to be rated. And I think there is a footnote either in this table or the previous table. So that's always gets kind of a missed, like we are like so focused on the exterior walls, but then when the code allows it to have unlimited opening, that doesn't really make sense to have rated wall. So it's kind of, there are footnotes for that. Again, for the projections, again, those like slight changes regarding overall the projections, like based upon the distance from the fire separation distance, how much you can project into or to the property lines, to the fire separation, like the overall distance. That's changed here. Next slide, please. Yeah, so firewall, this section, I think it has some changes as far as the overall. Again, I'm talking about those slight changes, nothing like something significant, but very, very slight changes as far as the overall firewall sections. I think a new section was added as far as or exception was added for the double firewalls in seismic categories D. And again, this goes into the details of the construction as it relates to the overall firewalls. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the floor openings, chapter, like again, 712, 713, the oral floor openings are like, okay, the floor openings, I have seen like, just because there is a floor opening, I have seen it interpreted as like, okay, now it's atrium, or and that's kind of gets confusing. So really, when there is an opening, it's the key is to kind of go from like step by step, like okay, opening, which kind of occupancy is it directly into like getting to the atrium? There are other I think sections in the code, especially in the 712 and 713, that you can go through and classify like what kind of opening is that, and then is it like a two-story interconnected space versus it's an atrium versus it's like a convenient stairs from chapter 10, and those I think exit, or it's like an exit access stair. So again, it really depends on how you classify it and how to correctly classify it. That's kind of a key. Next, please. Yes, some highlights as far as the WUI overall requirements. Some language has been added to clarify some other requirements. Some language has been added to specific labeling for some of the materials that's been used on the in the overall building. Chapter 8, again, it's all your interior finishes, like it's class ABC. It's based upon your what kind of a flame spread you have or smoke development index, and it really depends on all kinds of different tests that this chapter requires. It's ASTM E84. So it's really the material, whatever is you're planning to use, that needs to kind of go through all this testing before it can be allowed to be used. And a lot of times there are products available in the market where like, okay, my not necessarily interior finish, but like whatever my duct, or oh, it needs protection, like instead of having like a horizontal shaft, can I wrap it? Can I, like, are there like fire up? Can I use that? And again, I think that the key is the California State Marshal fire listing, and then that's necessary for a lot of projects. Then also the ICCS reports, that's again really helpful to justify again alternate methods and stuff. So next, please. Okay, I'll pass this to Hamed. Hopefully you have time. I know we are limited on timers. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Projecta. So as we're going through chapter 9, this chapter lists different fire protection system requirement in buildings with specific occupancies, and you can find the fire sprinkler requirement, fire alarm requirement, standpipe, etc. So the new requirement been added for fire sprinkler for open parking garages and the distilled spirit manufacturing and storage units. Also, the code reduced the limit, the height limit to utilize NFPA 13R standard versus NFPA 13. So if you haven't heard about NFPA 13R, it's standard, sprinkler standard specific for low-rise residential building versus the more rigorous NFPA 13 standard. But in the new code, the code reduced the height limit for those buildings, so it's more limited than 2019. And then there are many changes that related to the energy storage system, as we've seen different fires recently in the occupancies that used to store energy storage system or batteries. So there are new fire alarm requirement, including the automatic smoke detection system, has been added for those type of buildings. And then also chapter 9 discussed the smoke control requirement, and one changes to smoke control specifically mentions that it should take less than 90 seconds for all smoke control equipment to go to the final status, where this used to be based on the designer approach. And then chapter 9 discussed fire department connection, fire pump, fire command center, and specifically the new change for the fire command center. It asked for the signage for the fire command center, where it was open to the AHJ interpretation on the signage itself. Again, as we're going forward, so chapter 10 is one of definitely most important chapter for us as fire protection engineer. It discussed egress and exiting requirement in different building. Most of the requirements from chapter 8 are basically same as the previous code. And then we're not anticipating like changes in many chapters. So in chapter 10, we have the occupant load calculation, table 1004.5 lists the occupant load calculation for each occupancies. And then in the 2022 code, that one change that has been added is the requirement for smoke control, smoke protected assemblies. But in general, we need to design the egress based on the occupant load using the occupant load factor 0.3 and 0.2. If we have sprinkler and voice evacuation system, we can reduce those occupant load, except if you have group H or I occupancy. So these are the same from the previous code. And then there's been a new requirement added for the unoccupied mechanical room and the penthouses. So it basically added some exception for those. And then it says if you have the new requirement for the electrical room is says instead of meeting the CBC, you need to meet the NFPA 70 requirements. And then in general, the code doesn't allow passing through more than one level when exiting to the exit access there. In the new 2020 code, there's some exception added to this requirement where you are exiting through the atrium or exiting through the open stair between the occupied roof. And then there's been some minor updates in the door sizes and the stair landing depth in the new code. And then one other changes in the code language. It says where in the location where you can have only one exit, the language in 2019 code used to limit the maximum common path of travel from those areas. where in the new code, it changed to maximum exit access travel distance. So that is one of the changes in the code language and might affect the egress design per the new code. As you may know, the common path is basically the distance from the most remote area of the room all the way to the location where the occupant have the option to choose one exit. Like in this case, if someone moving from location B all the way to here, now they have two options for the exit going to the left side or to the right side. So in this case, we should measure the common path of travel from B all the way to the star location. So there are requirements in chapter 10 limiting the common path of travel for different occupancy that also carried over from the previous code. Also, there's a requirement for the exit separation. It says where you need more than one exit per code, then the exit needs to be separated. If you need 3 or more exit, or even if you need 2 exit. So the requirement is the same as the 2019 code. It's 1/3 of diagonal for sprinkler building between the 2 exits, or 1/2 for non-sprinkler building. And if you have a rated corridor like here, you can measure the exit separation throughout the rated corridor instead of just a single line between the 2 exit doors. There is some other updates in the code language. Again, the code provides the maximum exit access travel distance in section 1017.2 in the table, basically carried over from the 2019 code. And then it says if you have 2 exits, the requirement needs to be measured to the nearest exit, which added more clarification than the previous code. But there's still no changes since then. And then the other changes, it says the exit permitted through an elevator lobby in except group I occupancies. But when you need 2 exits, at least one of them shall not pass through the elevator lobby. Again, section 1019 is almost the same as the 2019 code. Provide requirement for the exit access stair, and one of the main one was the exit pass cannot pass more than 1 story going through the exit access stair. But this section added new exceptions for the exterior stair between the occupied roof, so it allows to travel more than 1 story in those conditions. Other section of chapter 10 provides the requirement for the exit stairs and exit passageway. So in the past, the code and the new code, the code doesn't allow penetration into the exit stair. So now the requirement has been added for the structural elements supporting the stairs, so those also cannot penetrate the stairs. There are some other exit element that has been discussed in chapter 10, like aisles and corridors. There are some exceptions for group L for the aisles and corridors in the new code, but basically the most items are carried over from the 2019, except for group I, when the corridor rating has been changed for group I2 and I2.1. Then the code discussed the horizontal exit, section 1026. So I'm more faster as we're getting to the end of the presentation. So these are the horizontal acid is basically a rated wall. Then whenever you pass the wall, it feels like that you are outside the building. So the wall need to have a rating requirement, and then both sides of the wall need to have a refuge area. Chapter 10 also discuss the accessible exiting. There are some changes for the size in the wheelchair space for the accessible exiting. And then the requirement change for the accessible elevator requirement now include occupied roofs to consider for the accessible elevator requirements. And then again, section 1009 discussed the accessible egress for the mezzanine, and saying in the other areas, if you have the two communication, you can utilize some exceptions there. As we go through chapter 10, the section 1010 discussed the requirement for the exit doors. There are not major changes, except that the sections have been rearranged since the 2019 code. There are some more allowances on the locking devices since the 2019 code. And then there are some changes in the latching operation for the exit doors. The other exit element that is discussed in chapter 10 are the ladders. Usually the code doesn't allow using ladder in the exit pass, except a very unique situation in the roof where the access is just for the maintenance area, not for the occupied area, and etc. The new requirement for the ladder is just adding the live load calculation for the ladder. So now it needs to maintain or hold a specific live load per chapter 16. There are also some changes in the section numbers. The egress code moved to 1029. The assembly moved to 1030. So these are basically the code section chapters moved to different sections. And then as we move through the code, we have the rooftop structure in chapter 15. So again, there are some changes in the section numberings and those stuff, but basically same at 2019. The building code also discussed the elevator requirement in chapter 30. There are some changes in the elevator requirement, such as the elevator communication system in chapter 3001. And also the code specifically says that FSAE not required for the below grade parking garages. This also been in the 2019 code with July supplements. But also the new requirement, the new exception added that the FSA not required to serve the top floor where it's being used for the equipment only. And then the chapter 3008 discussed the occupant evacuation elevator, which are very rare. I think one of the only project that utilizes the Fremont Facebook tower that we work with PAFA for the occupant evacuation elevators. This is like one of the first project that utilizing the occupant evacuation elevators. And then chapter 3006 discussed the requirement for the elevator hoistway and protection and lobbies. Basically says elevators require lobby except on level 1 or level of discharge. or where the elevator open to the open parking garages, and also discuss the option to add pressurization instead of lobby. Although this might not be very common, there are some issues during the design and use of elevator pressurization, as we've seen in the previous projects. So this is not a very common approach, and most projects, they prefer having traditional lobby or other approaches to protect the hoistway. The other changes to the code is basically changing risk category 3 and added the building containing a public assembly space with occupant load of more than 300 and the cumulative public assembly occupant load of 2,500 to risk category 3. And then there are some other changes in section 315 and 3313 in the code. Also, California Fire Code has been updated to 2022 version. The most important change was that adding the new portable and generator and the electrical energy storage system, as I mentioned before, as we've seen more fires recently in those occupancies. So with that, just want to thank you for your time attending today's presentation, and let us know if you have any questions.
Yeah, I see some questions in the chat. I can go through some of them. So the latest question is from Stephanie. Can we discuss in more details the exterior doors egressing into the interior building? Yes, so that's kind of a newly added requirement in the code. And I think it was slide, give me a second, it was.
Ahmed, you went through that one pretty quickly, and I was interested in hearing more about it. So
yeah, so it was let's see, not this one. Where there is a.
No, I think that was it.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So the signage, window key lock, two-way communication, max 300 occupants. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Basically, the code added requirements in the 2020 code, saying if you have like a balcony or exterior space, you need to provide a specific items like signage, two-way communication, and then you cannot have more than 300 occupants on the exterior side.
But you can lock it.
Yeah, as long as you meet the lock requirements in chapter 10, like they need to be open in the direction of the egress, and then or provide with the other features that allows locking per chapter 10.
It's interesting. It has like this two-way communication requirement. It's the same two-way communication system, I believe, that you would see at the elevator lobbies from chapter 10, section 10.009. I believe the same two-way communication system that you also have in the balcony or in your terrace area where people can call for help. And but yeah, it's a new, and then like as far as the window, like most of the buildings are like glass buildings, so that's but when there's a solid wall and people from inside cannot see outside that clearly, or vice versa, I think that window is to have like view of what's happening outdoors as far as any emergencies.
Thank you. You'll see I'm the only person who wrote questions into the chat. So if anybody else has questions, feel free to interject at any time. One of my other questions was just about, we were talking about CBC, the occupied roofs no longer count against your building area. or that's been clarified that they don't count against building area, but wanting more information about plumbing code, and Maya answered that, you know, the CPC requirements are based on your use and not necessarily aligning with the California building code. So you guys have any other comments on that?
Yeah, honestly, I will leave the plumbing code knowledge up to you all and skip that question.
I see Linda has a hand raised. Linda, you want to go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. I had a couple of questions and I may have written something down wrong, but there was table 705.5 or 705.8. I scribbled, so I wasn't really sure if I got it right.
I think it was
705.5 or 705.8.
705.5. It's regarding the exterior wall, the separation.
Right, the exterior openings. Now, does this apply to single family residential as well?
You know what? Let's see. It will be under R3. So if you see under the occupancy, the R, so to answer your questions, I'll have to take a look, but generally this table is applied to all the occupancies, and there could be very specific either exceptions or specific requirements related to a specific occupancy. Yeah.
Okay, so we need to check that out in terms of the occupancy. That was my question, because it looked like some of the restrictions would have been difficult for single family residential. Then I had another question about NFPA 13R. If the height limit is reduced to 13 feet, now what happens to 3, 4, or 5 story buildings? Because 30 feet is only really a 2-story building.
Yeah, so that's the new.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, that's a new requirement. So whenever you have more than 30 feet, I think it was in chapter 9, you cannot utilize the NFPA 13R. So, and basically some jurisdiction, they're not really reluctant to use NFPA 13R anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the difference between the 13 and 13R, again, at a very high level, I think 13R, I think, allows exceptions in some specific areas to eliminate sprinklers in some of the spaces in the building, versus 13R is pretty much sprinkler throughout. And 13R, NFPA 13 is always like considered to be more robust system than 13R. So.
Okay, so we'd have to look at the exceptions and such. I'm just trying to figure out at what point that applies.
Yeah,
it's going to apply for 3-story buildings.
So I would definitely look at the particular section, if there are like any exceptions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I see a few other questions coming in here. Jason, do you want to just restate your question? Also note that we're coming up on the 7 o'clock hour. So if folks need to drop off, you're welcome to, but we'll stick around for any other questions as long as we need to. Thank you very much. Jason, go ahead.
Sure. I was just trying to get clarification on the comment mentioned about elements that can penetrate an exit enclosure. And I know there's pipes and certain exceptions that have been used over time, but there was a comment about structures can no longer penetrate, or structural elements. So can you explain that more? Are you talking about the supporting structures and to be independent for the stair itself?
So so basically it's for the penetration itself. Like if you have a stair door you have to either, or sorry, if you have the stair wall, you have to either maintain the elements inside the stair itself. So basically, you cannot penetrate the stair wall per the new exceptions.
So example would be multi-story enclosure, multi-stair landings, and usually the structure, extends into the stair enclosure and supports the walls and supports the landings. So it's not quite clear how you would make that independent.
So basically, I think that is part of like a roof construction. You can use the roof construction as a support, but then you cannot penetrate the stair wall with a joist to support the exit stairway. I don't know if that answers your question.
A little bit. I'll look into it more, but thanks.
Liz, did you want to talk about your question here? You were asking if construction of an essential services building require an IOR out of school.
I was just curious if anybody knew, we've got all these new codes and all of the constructability issues, and essential service buildings require schools require an IOR, but do all essential services buildings require an IOR? If anybody happens to know? I mean, to look at the question that was just asked, to make sure that there aren't inadvertently any supporting elements penetrating exit walls.
Yeah, me personally, I don't have experience with IOR, but if anyone else want to chime in.
Yeah, the inspector of record is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think the IORs are typically, I have seen like for the HCI, like hospital projects. I do not know about the essential, so sorry.
No, that's okay. I just thought, since you were all here and paying attention, I just thought I'd ask. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. There was a question from me earlier in the chat here, just asking very early on, you were talking about the new clarifications of the secondary structural members. And I think what that section was clarifying is that lateral seismic bracing, diagonal bracing would not be required to be fireproofed, because that's been something that's kind of been debated here and there.
Yeah, usually we've seen that being used in different projects. There's a requirement saying that if those bracing connected to the fireproof element, then you need to extend the fireproofing 12 inches through the bracing. But in general, yeah, there's that exception that can be applicable.
Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge, and really appreciate all that you've shared with us. And I'm sure a few folks will be in touch with further questions. Thank you all very much for attending, and we hope to see you in March in person on March 15th at Insight Source for our program sponsored by GCI.